go back to the 14th century, about 50 or 60 years after the suppression of the Knights Templar. So there's a proximity in time with the suppression of the Templars and the first Masonic rituals. I mean, in the same century. And from Scotland, which is where the rumors have it that the Templars wound up. Some Templars wound up in Scotland, where they were fighting against, the King of England at one point, and there were all this stuff going on. So there is a connection, and I think there really is. And I think that might be part of the reason why there is this tremendous hostility between the Freemasons and the organized Catholic Church, is a recognition that these are survivors of the Templars.
Okay. Now, I want to explore that a little bit further, but the hostility to the Freemasons doesn't come exclusively for the Roman Catholic Church. A lot of Protestants denounce the Freemasons as well.
Of course. Yep.
How do the Freemasons define this connection to the Godhead, then? Is their definition of the Godhead a problem for, well, not just Christians, but for Jews and Muslims as well?
Well, the problem is that it's very ambiguous. I mean, the problem with Freemasonry from the point of view of any denomination is that a Masonic lodge will accept people from any monotheistic religion. So there is no insistence on one dogma over another. So if you have people who basically mistrust each other, whether they're Jews, Muslims, Christians, or any combination thereof, you're going to have a hard time identifying the Godhead in a case like that, because everyone has their point of view. What the Masons do is they call the Godhead the great architect of the universe.
Right.
And it's a very ambiguous and kind of vague term, but God as the creator, yes, but as the architect, because they're Freemasons after all, and they're involved with architecture. All of their symbolism is connected to architecture. So it's a great, the great geometer, the great person in the sky who, with the compasses and square, is designing the universe. Some people do have a problem with that. It's not specific enough. There's no mention, of course, of Jesus in that context at all. There are some odd mentionings of Jehovah, perhaps, in some contexts in some of the Masonic writings, but it's not in a purely Jewish context either. And of course, Allah is not, mentioned necessarily either. Although there were Muslim Masonic organizations in the Middle East just before World War I and through World War I into the 20s and 30s, there were certain Masonic groups that were Islamic-based, and there's still a few today that still exist in Egypt, for instance. But for the most part, people do have a problem with the non-denominational aspect of Freemasonry, because you can talk about God in the abstract, that's one thing. But then suddenly you're involved in what can only be described as a religious ritual. And this is, I think, where the problem comes in. You're performing a ritual, and even the Masonic leaders themselves don't have the capability of explaining exactly what that ritual means, So there's another level of ambiguity, right? So to a believing Christian who has his Bible, I mean, everything is clear, or as clear as it could be.
Right.
In a Masonic setting, you have an ambiguous ritual. I mean, you're led around blindfolded, you're tied, the blindfold is taken off, the point of a sword, all of these, very strange scenarios are acted out. You're given certain sacred words, as passwords to say, which seem to refer to Solomon's temple. So that alone, if you're a Jewish person and you're going through this reenactment of Solomon's temple, and it doesn't really mesh with what you've been brought up believing, you may have a doctrinal problem, an ideological problem there. The same thing with the third degree initiation, in which you are symbolically slain and then raised again, raised from the dead. As Hiram Abif was supposedly done. So you become not identified with Christ in a resurrection scenario, but with the man who built Solomon's temple for King Solomon. So it's this mix of all these ideas that are not adequately explained. And they're not adequately explained because the mystery is so important. To the Masons, you have to kind of come to this knowledge on your own. This realization of what all this means on your own. So you're raised from the dead, but you're not told exactly what that means.
Now, I've had discussions with friends who are Masons of various degrees. In fact, the young man who used to produce my radio show out in Missouri is now a Master Mason, 3rd degree. Another gentleman I know is a 33rd degree in the Scottish Rite. And he claims, by the way, that it's a Christian organization. One of the claims made by my friend, the Master Mason, is that there is nothing beyond that 3rd degree, that is all that there is to Freemasonry. Do the higher degrees, whether Scottish Rite, York Rite, or any other a path, begin to explain these mysteries? And if so, what do they mean?
Well, there are 2 major rites. There's the Scottish Rite and the York Rite. And then there are other Masonic groups which are not considered orthodox by the other Masons, but which are still very strong. Co-Masonry is one example, which is based more on an esoteric framework as well, and which admits women. That's another whole conversation. But when you were talking about the additional degrees, the extra 30 degrees, for instance, that Scottish Rite Freemasonry has, number one, the initiations are not separate. There are not another 30 separate initiations. There's a couple of initiations, a few in which they're sort of telescoped. You'll have, 4, 5, 6 or something all gathered together as one initiation, et cetera, et cetera. There are other levels of discussion. There are other levels of instruction, in a sense, during the ritual itself. But it brings you into even more confusion if you don't have a really good grounding in comparative religion, for instance, or in Hermeticism. If you don't really have a good grasp of that, the stuff is going to sound very, very strange to you. I mean, there's a Knights Templar degree. There's a Rosicrucian degree. There's the implication that Freemasonry, at least in the Scottish Rite, is connected to the Knights Templar, is connected to the Rosicrucian Society, to Christian Rosenkreuz and that whole mythology. It's a whole other field of endeavor, a whole other field of study. And these different degrees keep adding and adding, but I don't know if they adequately explain the first 3 degrees. Most Freemasons will say that the first 3 degrees are the most important. Those are the critical degrees. And at the same time, they will say that Freemasonry itself is only the outer court or the porch in front of the temple.
Okay.
It doesn't really lead you inside the temple. This is preparation for going into the temple. So it's mystery built on top of mystery, built on top of mystery, using mysteries to explain other mysteries.
The famous line from the movie by JFK where Joe Pesci's character, David Ferry, it's an enigma wrapped in a mystery, whatever. Yeah.
Yes, right. Yeah. Well, that's pretty much it. And Masonic writers agree on this. They agree that they don't necessarily understand all of Freemasonry. Arthur Edward Waite, was a Mason and a member of the Golden Dawn. He wrote a lot of books on the esoteric sciences. He wrote books on magic, on Freemasons, on the Rosicrucians, and he said, that Freemasons probably know as much about their subject as anybody else. I mean, there's just, there's no big difference. As a non-Mason or a Mason, that doesn't mean you're going to understand your history any better. You're not going to understand the rituals any better, except for the fact that you've gone through the rituals. And that's the critical point in our discussion. We can talk endlessly about what all these things mean. But the critical aspect of Freemasonry, and the Masons will agree, are the initiatory rituals themselves, the experience of going through the rituals. That's the crux of the matter. The rest of the stuff is explanatory material. You can take it or leave it as you will. But the really important part of it is the initiation rituals.
Why is that?
Well, because we can talk about this from an intellectual point of view. We can do comparative studies on it. We can write the books like I've written on it. But without going through the ritual itself, without having that traumatic experience, that deep psychological event in your mind, there is no real connection to Freemasonry. The initiations are what are critical and are crucial to the experience. You have to become initiated. You have to go through the initiation process, not only as the initiate, not only as the person being brought in, but eventually you'll be bringing in other people. You'll be participating in the ritual to initiate others. And I think it's those two aspects of initiation that are so important to Freemasonry and to understanding Freemasonry. It's a kind of psychological behavior modification, if you will. It's like a hypnotic state, trance-like state that you're put in because you're brought into a situation which is otherworldly. The temple is arranged in a very specific way. You can only move in the temple in a very specific way. You're led by the hand to various stations. You're told to make certain pronouncements. You are told to sort of twist yourself in odd ways for various gestures, for various recognition symbols. All these things are done. So your body, your mind, they're being occupied completely. There's no room in there for contemplation. There's no room for introspection. You're being taken through a very strange set of physical motions. The visual stuff around you is strange. It's not everyday life. Everything has changed. Everybody's dressed in robes. There's candles. There's altars set up. All sorts of things are being done. There's people sitting on thrones. There's all kinds of things that are taking place that are kind of religious. They smack of ritualized religion, something like Roman Catholicism or High Church Episcopal or Anglican, something like that, almost Russian Orthodox in some cases. There's an element of that very strong, and yet it's not that, And I think that's where a lot of religions have a problem with this, because there's initiation in, for instance, Christianity. We may call it baptism. Mm-hmm. We can, in the Catholic Church, is baptism and confirmation, which is like a secondary initiation, if you will.
No, Lutheran churches too, yeah.
Right. So you have these things, which are, but you're surrounded in a pretty much normal setting. You're in the church that you've known maybe your whole life. You've grown up in this church, and now you're making an act of confirmation in that church. But in Freemasonry, everything is different. Everything's been changed. Your point of reference is gone. Your point of reference is strictly Freemasonry and what they're trying to tell you, what they're trying to instruct, or how they're trying to talk to you. So it's an interesting, to me, a fascinating example of what we could only call a cult. The Freemasons will, hate me for calling them a cult. As far as they're concerned, they're just a bunch of nice guys. And maybe they are. And I think in general, probably 85-90% of Freemasons that you'll ever run into are people who just, found themselves fulfilled in some way through Freemasonry. Mm-hmm. They enjoy the social networking. That's very important. And they really don't pay much attention to the history or to the ideological conflicts that would exist. They just don't care. They go through what they have to go through, and they're part of a group, and they feel like they belong to something, mm-hmm. something exclusive. Something, that not everyone can join, that everyone belongs to, and, fulfills some need in them for this. But this situation could be abused, as we've seen with so many other types of groups, other types of cults. The initiatory process can be abused, certainly. You can use some of the same ideas and use them in a malevolent way. You mm-hmm. can essentially weaponize, mm-hmm. ritual. And you can. People have done that. I'm thinking of Jim Jones or Charlie Manson or people like that. I'm not saying these were Freemasons, but what I'm saying is some of these same techniques could be used in a malicious way to brainwash, to control people's minds, to make them do things they would not ordinarily do.
Right. And ultimately what it comes down to is the question that you posed earlier. Why? Why do you need the ritual if this is simply a social networking group? A group of like-minded businessmen or community people who just want to get together to fellowship and do good works for the local community. I mean, I volunteered when I was in Scouts, which, by the way, I went through the ritual to join the Order of the Arrow, which the more I learn right. about it and remember, the more Freemasonic I remember it being. But volunteered at a Shriners Hospital. And there's no question that they do good works, but the point of the ritual, what is it? Why go through all of that just to belong to this organization? Getting back to the title of your book and the connections to Solomon's Temple, why Solomon's Temple as the focus of the Freemasons' Lodge?
Well, I think this is the part that's very interesting to me, very exciting from an academic kind of point of view. And that is that